Here we go with another edition of Why Wasn't It Better? I'm your host, Patrick Darms.
And I'm Anton Paras.
And this is the podcast where we discuss hyped up, somewhat disappointing films. We'll introduce the film. We'll tell you why it was chosen for this episode. We'll tell you how it got made. And then we will provide you with a few reasons that answer the question, why wasn't it better? Just a friendly reminder that our podcast is still very much in its infancy. We're in the middle of our first season. So if you like what you hear, please like us, follow us, review us, give us a 5-star rating, whatever platform you get your podcasts on. We recently expanded to Amazon Music, and you can follow us on Twitter at WWIB Podcast. If you'd like to get in touch with us directly, you can email us at wwibpodcast@gmail.com. Anton, thanks for joining me once again as we delve into these. We're in the middle of our first season now.
Yeah, I think that it's been a lot of talk about movies. We've had quite a journey getting here. We've been talking about some movies from 20 years ago, 10 years ago, a film that just released in theaters recently.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun talking about Mario.
Oh yeah, that Super Mario movie.
As we're getting to the end of April, just to give listeners an idea of when we're recording this, and some non-movie talk. This is quite a good time of the year if you're into sports. Baseball's just getting started. The NBA playoffs are in full tilt. I like the Knickerbockers' chances against Cleveland. Anton, I know you in one of our earlier recordings, you guaranteed the listeners a Warriors repeat. How do you feel about their title defense? As of now, they are tied 2-2 with the Sacramento Kings.
As a diehard Warrior fan, my stance will always stay the same. They got this in the bag. They just need to finish the job.
Mean they're going to beat the Kings, or they're going to repeat?
Yes to both. But then, of course, the fan in me that is also just a pessimist because I overthink different aspects of the Warriors. I think we are so lucky that we won the last game, and that Steph's legacy will not be tarnished because we lost a playoff game because we called a timeout without actually having any timeouts. That was rough.
That was kind of puzzling to see. It was like he pulled a Chris Webber.
Yeah, it's what happens. But hey, won the game, so it doesn't even matter. Won't even be a discussion point in history.
Didn't look like the Kings were ready to take that.
No, like even before that happened, though, it was like a 6-point. It was like a 6-point game or something in the last. Yeah, in the last 2 minutes. And if he hadn't made that mistake, it would have still been the Warriors' possession with like under 2 minutes to go. And it's like basically that's game, right? But the fact that they brought it so close, it's just like, ugh.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. Now, across the pond, we've got some very, very spicy soccer. The Champions League semifinals are set. We've got a Milan derby, or should I say a Milan derby on one of them. And then a rematch from last year between the holders, Real Madrid and Manchester City. Both of those matchups I am really looking forward to. And then this Wednesday, the Premier League title will probably be decided because Arsenal are going to Manchester City.
Oh yeah, we have so much good sports on. Outside of pro sports, I'm probably going to pick up pickleball soon. So
very excited.
Just throwing that out there to all these listeners.
I'm sure that is what they've been looking forward to hear that.
Oh yeah, just wait, everyone. More pickleball updates to come.
We are here to talk about your selection for this week's episode, Iron Man 2.
Bum, 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 bum,
our very first Marvel movie.
Welcome to the MCU. Let's go.
Yes. I'll intro this. So with the world now aware that he is Iron Man, billionaire inventor Tony Stark faces pressure from all sides to share his technology with the military. He is reluctant to divulge the secrets of his armored suit, fearing the information will fall into the wrong hands. With Pepper Potts and Rhodey Rhodes by his side, Tony must forge new alliances and confront a powerful new enemy. Iron Man 2 was released on May 7th, 2010 by Marvel Studios and Paramount Pictures, directed by Jon Favreau, screenplayed by Justin Theroux, starring Robert Downey Jr., Gwyneth Paltrow, Mickey Rourke, Don Cheadle, Scarlett Johansson, Sam Rockwell, and Samuel L. Jackson. A budget of $170 million and a box office return of $623 million. Anton, Why have you chosen Iron Man 2 for this week's episode?
Personally, I've always loved Iron Man, like the character from the comic books. And when we actually think about the Iron Man franchise, like the 2008 film successfully kicked off the Marvel Cinematic Universe, as well as brought back to life, truly resurrected Robert Downey Jr., one of the most talented actors of his generation, and bringing him back after a very controversial portion of his career to be a huge star, one of the biggest stars of the world as Tony Stark in Iron Man. So personally, just very excited to touch on the MCU in general because we start to go into what is now known as Phase 1 of the MCU. Follow up. It was a follow up to the first Iron Man and the Incredible Hulk. But at the time, there was a lot of speculation or just a lot of thought around what the films were going to lead up to, and at the same time, like the viability of having like a comic book big box office comic book franchises, and what that actually would turn into in the long run. I think that history has shown that it's very very profitable. So it's always good to look at some of the films more critically that we'll touch on. We may not totally agree is like the best films or the best showings from the MCU.
You could make a case that almost every movie in the MCU could be included on this podcast. They were all hyped in their own way, right? Everyone is, or I don't know about now, but back then everyone was excited for every Marvel movie that was coming out. I know you are, you're a comic book guy. I'm a lover of comic books, but I'm far from an expert. I've read very popular ones like The Dark Knight Returns, V for Vendetta, Watchmen, but I don't think I've ever read a Marvel comic book in my life. I just know them because of the animated shows from the 90s. I watched the Spider-Man show a little bit. I watched the X-Men show a little bit, but I was always more of a Batman guy when I was a kid. Which is not to say I didn't like Marvel stuff, but when we were growing up in the 90s, Batman was the only superhero that was really on the big screen. Marvel just didn't exist. For whatever reason, they could never get their shit together until Blade came along, the Marvel movie that everybody forgets. But the MCU, I have to ask you as a comic book fan, what would have happened if the Incredible Hulk had been the first movie in the MCU as opposed to the first Iron Man? Because the first Iron Man was wildly successful as soon as it came out. Incredible Hulk, not so much.
I think we kind of got an answer with that with the Hulk Ang Lee's depiction much, much earlier on. It turned into a very cold winter for superhero films.
Yeah. Oh, we're going to be covering that movie as well as The Incredible Hulk.
Which, funny enough, I've revisited it and looking at the lens of the themes of actually looking at how the elements and themes of how you analyze what's being displayed in the Hulk in the storyline. I thought it was actually very mature and a fun way that Ang Lee did it, but it wasn't a good movie and it was kind of boring. But what was fun about Iron Man is that it really brought to life the comic book.
They invested in the right star. They took a risk on Downey. It paid off in spades, especially for Downey. He's probably one of the richest people in the state of California at this point, with all the money that he's allegedly
not
made.
Not even just California. I think in general, he is so rich.
His great grandchildren will never have to work.
No.
So, everyone was excited to see him reprise his role as Tony Stark. Pretty much after the first Iron Man was released, it sounds like they went into pre-production for this one pretty quickly. Iron Man 2 would end up outgrossing the first Iron Man, but it was immediately seen as inferior. The reason why you made a good selection here is, out of curiosity to prepare for this podcast, I looked up rankings of the MCU films, and this is always ranked low.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
My memory of this is I didn't know what to expect from the MCU when this came out. Nobody really did. But I went to see it. I kind of felt the same way about it that I did the first movie. Now, my opinion on both of those movies has changed over time, which we'll get into a little bit later. As a whole, I think the MCU is a masterpiece. I can't say that about all the individual films. the fact that they were able to land the plane with Infinity War, it is pretty impressive that they were able to pull this off. I kind
Yeah.
of I made this comparison to someone recently about while they're very different in the James Bond series, we're talking about a collection of 25 plus films. They're not all going to be good. There's no way. The quality, it varies. As far as the Marvel movies go, I consider a handful of them brilliant, some of them bad, and most of them are just okay. But as a package
Right.
deal, it's pretty impressive. I feel like most comic book fans that I know feel the same way. They're generally impressed with the MCU.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think my memory of this film was more of the comic book fan in me just being critical of certain elements. Are we really going to double down on ACDC in this film? Or how much more commercialized can like this franchise become? And that's just part of it being knowing it's going to be a big film. It's like, yes, like
Yeah.
at the end of the day, I understand like they want to make lots and lots of money. So really putting those efforts into commercializing like Iron Man 2 and really playing up different aspects of that really is just a lot of product placement at the end of the day. But that's not even like the worst part of it. Just like not even like the part of it that I think like critically or like why I feel like I like this film less than the first. And we'll start to touch on more of this, but in general, like you put it you put it really well that like there's no way that you're going to have a home run on each Marvel film, but I think we had the earlier part of phase 1, you get to see the studio start to play with what can we do to really push product placement and like really milk this cash cow while putting out like these Marvel films to continue on to continue like the phase for Marvel. So we see a bit of that in a lot of following films, whether that's like the Thor film, really like even the Iron Man film. It's like a lot of it is like a glorified like um, car commercial, but like oh dude, yeah, like look back on it, it's like
Oh
I think
yeah.
they're just selling Audis left and right.
And then
Um,
Acuras later on.
yeah,
There's one
so
shot in the
it's
Avengers during the battle in New York where they just show like the back end of an Acura MDX. Just
oh yeah, and I get it. It makes
yeah,
sense, but like I think this is like maybe it was a little too heavy-handed in Iron Man 2. Starting to notice that from a comic book film lens or comic book fan film lens. But
it's
I
fair.
digress. Let's start to talk about the production history. How does that sound?
Sounds good. By the way, I don't. Before I touch on that, I don't think you're being controversial by saying you like this less than the first one. I don't know anyone that likes this more than the first Iron Man, thus making it a perfect choice for this podcast.
But there are things that I did like about it, but we'll touch on that,
Definitely.
won't we?
Same. Immediately following the first Iron Man movie's release, Marvel announced that they were developing a sequel and Jon Favreau agreed to return as director. Justin Theroux wrote the script, based on a story developed by Favreau and Downey himself. Now, Theroux had co written Tropic Thunder, and he was hired after Robert Downey recommended him. Shane Black, the very well known screenwriter who wrote like stuff like Lethal Weapon and Long Kiss Goodnight, he gave the filmmakers some advice on the script, and he suggested to Favreau and Downey that they model Stark on Robert Oppenheimer, who became depressed with being the quote destroyer of worlds after working on the Manhattan Project. Shane Black would later go on to write and direct the third Iron Man movie, which we will also be covering. Don Cheadle was hired to replace Terrence Howard as Rhodey, which caused some stir. The official explanation given was that it was just a salary dispute. Now, Entertainment Weekly reported that Jon Favreau had not been happy with Howard's performance in the first film, often reshooting or cutting his scenes. When it was time for the sequel to be made, Favreau and co-writer Justin Theroux purposefully reduced Howard's screen time, which led Marvel to ask Howard to accept an 80% pay cut. Howard refused and he was replaced with Cheadle. Now, Howard later stated that Downey, quote, took the money that was supposed to go to me and pushed me out. Because Downey got a huge raise, shall we say, for making this one. He only made 500 grand off the first Iron Man. It's pretty
Right.
interesting tidbit. I think his salary for this one was 10 million. So not bad, Robert. I like Don Cheadle, and I think this decision worked out for everyone, except for Terrence Howard. Didn't work out for
Yeah.
him.
Sorry, Hustle and Flow. Didn't work out this
Yeah.
time.
Here's the big one. Emily Blunt was originally supposed to play Black Widow, but she was ultimately unable to take the role due to her commitment to the movie Gulliver's Travels. This is an all-time bad decision, and that is how Scarlett Johansson landed the role. I think that worked out well for everyone, except Emily Blunt.
I sense a theme.
Yeah, pretty baffling that she missed out on this. I've never even heard of Gulliver's Travels. I mean, I know the it's an old book and an old movie, but I didn't even know there was a
Did it have Jack Black in it?
no idea.
I'm
Do you think
just.
Emily Blunt just like sits in her house and gets mad about this?
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, she had a chance to be part of the MCU,
Yeah, I mean, she's
but
had a really good. She still has a really good career going, but
does she have
man,
MCU money?
no, probably
No,
not.
no.
Because Scarlett Johansson obviously a star long before this movie, but this really, you know, elevated her, or did it? I don't know. She
No, she
had
stands on the shoulders of Ghost World. I get it.
right, and the Horse Whisperer, old school '90s movie.
Both
Uh,
old school 90s movies.
Now, take this one with a grain of salt because this comes from IMDb trivia. Al Pacino was considered for the role of Justin Hammer. I don't know how close he came to taking the role, but that would have made this a very different film. Now, after the release of Iron Man 2, Disney agreed to pay Paramount $115 million dollars for the distribution rights to the third Iron Man and the Avengers. The deal also allowed Paramount to continue to collect box office fees that it would have earned from distributing the film. And that's basically the beginning of how Disney ended up getting involved in these films. They ended up, of course, acquiring Marvel Studios in 2012. I had forgotten about this. When you watch these first few Marvel movies, you see the Paramount logo, and I was initially confused. I was like, Paramount, what happened here? And like, yeah, Disney wasn't involved at this point.
Right. Oh
So
man,
that,
just early on, like it's just so fun to think about. This was like it really
yeah,
was like let's go all in on Marvel.
it really is interesting to watch these early movies because it was almost like they didn't know what they were doing. And I don't mean they were incompetent, but at this point, there's certain expectations that you have when you're making a Marvel movie, capital M, capital M. It's much more of a cookie cutter franchise now than it was then. That's it for the production history. There's not a ton there. Seemed like a pretty straightforward production for the most part. Let's talk about why wasn't it better?
I'll take the first one. Why wasn't it better? Reason number one, studio interference. It's not fair to say that this movie had a troubled production, but based on Favreau's later comments, Marvel did not let him tell the story he originally intended to. And there was a considerable amount of friction between Favreau and the Marvel higher ups. They really wanted to explore Demon in the Bottle storyline. A bunch of deleted scenes that Marvel cut from the movie. At the end of the day, Marvel didn't want a movie about the superhero being an alcoholic. And Demon in a Bottle, you can see the skeleton of it, but they didn't fully commit. And being a comic book fan, the Demon in a Bottle storyline is iconic to the character, important to understanding Tony Stark. So during development, Favreau said that the film would explore Stark's alcoholism. While promoting the first film, Downey stated that Stark would probably develop a drinking problem as he unable to cope with his age, the effects of revealing he's Iron Man, and Pepper getting a boyfriend. And Downey later claimed that the film was not a strict adaptation of Demon in a Bottle storyline from the comic book series, but was instead about the interim space between the origin and the Demon story arc. So the Marvel executives were having Favreau and Thoreau rewrite the script as the film was still shooting. In particular, elements such as the increased prominence of the S.H.I.E.L.D. subplot were the result of a need to establish the greater MCU in preparation for the Avengers at the expense of the coherence of the film's own plot. These disputes got so bad that Favreau turned down directing Iron Man 3. So we have a lot of friction with the studios. And you have
Yeah,
to read between the lines on this subject. Favreau and especially Downey were very careful regarding their comments about the story. We listened to some very brief interviews they gave about it and feeling like getting the impression they were disappointed rather than angry. It's always not fun when not able to execute on the vision that was once had. So obviously Favreau didn't let this experience poison his relationship with Marvel. He kept playing the role of Happy Hogan for several more movies, very successfully, and even ended up directing the highly successful Jungle Book and Lion King remakes. So safe to say that he was able to, keep that, did not burn that bridge. The alternate ending just isn't as good, but it's closer to what may have been had Favreau not been restricted. There's about 20 minutes of deleted scenes on YouTube, and I definitely tell listeners, give it a watch. These deleted scenes are a rare behind the scenes look, as Marvel would cease making them available after the first Thor, which is kind of a bummer. I mean, it's
Yeah,
always cool to see this kind of footage, and
they're not
I
hiding
think
it.
that. What's that? One more time?
They're not hiding it because the
Right.
deleted scenes that you can find on YouTube, they're also, I think that they are on Disney Plus. If you go into the extras of Iron Man 2, I think they're all there still. But to your point, after Thor, they stopped making them available. And you're right, it's a shame.
Yeah. In terms of the production as well, when we actually look critically on the fight scenes in this film, very, very short. Your thoughts on this, Patrick?
Yeah, there's not a lot of action in this movie. You have the Monaco scene, and you basically have the climax, which is at the Stark Expo. That's kind of it. And no, of course, the Stark Expo is cross cut between Black Widow when she's storming Justin Hammer's like lab, but
Mm-hmm.
there's just not as much action as this in this one as there is in the first one. Now, I wasn't expecting some knockdown Avengers length action scenes, but I do feel like this film lacks it, and you can directly attribute that to the script and the studio interference. Now, our second reason, of course, is the storytelling, and I would encourage all the listeners, if you have any curiosity about this film and the story that Favreau and Downey and Theroux really wanted to tell, the novelization of this film is much closer to the original screenplay. The novelization that I have, it has all of the deleted scenes that you just mentioned, Anton, and it goes much deeper into the alcohol stuff. I wish they had continued the novelizations for the rest of these Marvel movies. This is the last novelization that Marvel ever did. So there's one for the first Iron Man, there's one for this, and there's one for the Incredible Hulk, and that's it. Which is it's a shame because it's always an interesting. Most of the time with novelizations, you get something that's very close to the finished film, but occasionally, like with this, it deviates not massively from the finished film, but there's some pretty big differences that we'll get into when we start to talk about the script. Now, you touched on this. By the way, this is going to be our second reason for why wasn't this better is the storytelling slash script. Now, Anton, you touched on this a little bit earlier about the interference that Marvel put on the filmmakers here. In this film, there was definitely a mandate to set up the rest of the MCU in the way that the first Iron Man didn't have to. This movie, to me, it's almost like fluff, like filler. It's like a vehicle for introducing new Marvel characters who would later appear in the Avengers. You mentioned the Shield subplot, Black Widow, Nick Fury. So like Whiplash, who's the allegedly the main villain of this movie, he was an intimidating presence in the early Monaco scene, which is a pretty exciting
It was
action
really
scene.
fun.
Yeah, it's fun. Doesn't last long, but it's fun. And then at the end, they just stick him in like another Iron Man suit. Now, this made the climax of this movie a little bit of a letdown for me, especially if you follow it on the heels of the first Iron Man, which also had suit on suit violence. In that case, it was Jeff Bridges. In this case, it's Mickey Rourke. But you can see how they corrected this in the third movie because they did they're not robots, but they made a non-robot character a threat to Iron Man with the the Mandarin slash the extremist virus thing. Now Mickey Rourke, who played Whiplash, Ivan Vanko, whatever, he later spoke about having many of his scenes cut. More of his scenes are featured in the novelization. Now he's supposed to be the main villain, and he's just not in the movie that much. Mickey Rourke he would dedicate a lot of his time to trashing this film and the MCU. It's kind of funny. Mickey Rourke just decided to burn that bridge after this came out. And one of the plot holes that I notice in this, Anton, is when you rewatch it, neither Tony nor Rhodes seems surprised to see Vanko alive at the end of the movie. Because remember, he allegedly dies in that prison explosion. and then he pops up at the end, and they don't really react to it. Now, one of the deleted scenes addresses this. They expand, where Rhodey comes in to Tony's lab and he announces like, "Oh, by the way, like Vanko died during a prison escape attempt." But it's kind of a big plot hole. The problem with Vanko for me is that despite being the alleged primary antagonist, like I said, he's completely absent from the real story. He only interacts with Tony in those two scenes, Monaco and at the finale at the Stark Expo. Now, considering who Vanko's father was and how they're supposed to be connected, they should have had more interaction. I feel like it would have benefited the plot if they had.
Yeah, in a deeper film, they would really dive into more how Vanko truly is the foil to Tony Stark. In many ways, just kind of two sides of a similar coin, where you have a genius that was able to recreate what Tony created, but also focus and obsessed with what is like stolen legacy or succession. So very interesting, but at the end of the day, just kind of turned into a villain with a fun accent.
Yeah, he's maybe on screen for 10 minutes, maybe a little bit more. It's not much.
Not much at all.
Their storylines definitely feel disconnected. And then 40 to 50 minutes in, this other plot thread gets introduced, which is this new element that Tony has to discover. I wanted to ask you about this because you're the comic book guy. So, Howard Stark, Tony's father, via theoretical physics, he discovered a new element, but he was unable to create it, and he left clues for it in the blueprints of the Stark Expo for his son to later find, and he would hope that his son would develop it. And this turns out to be the cure for Tony's palladium poisoning. Like, this never made sense to me, because how would the new element have helped Tony if his father didn't know that Tony was going to have an arc reactor in his chest? See where I'm going? I don't understand any of this.
Right.
This is the point. The movie really lost me at this point.
Yeah, I also had the same question. This did not make sense to me, nor I'm sure did it make sense to a lot of comic book fans.
Okay. I was hoping maybe you could explain something like, well, actually, in the comics, this makes perfect sense.
Like, no, this was absolutely a plot hole.
They don't explain it well. Yeah, he makes like a particle accelerator in like a basement. I understand it's a comic book movie. They didn't explain it well. And this is something, I'm going to go off on a tangent here slightly, but the Star Trek TV shows did this really well. They would introduce what are essentially made up things, made up technology, made up theories, but they made them sound plausible through like technological sounding explanations, and they kept the dialogue very serious. They could have used some of that here. But instead, we just get Tony making a particle accelerator in his basement, and he's just like, bang, new element, I'm cured. Now, this is not mentioned in the movie. This is one of the reasons why I'm going to keep bringing up this novelization. But you know this, and they should have explained this better. Vanko and Hammer are both working with the 10 Rings behind the scenes. The 10 Rings are the organization, of course, that's the Mandarin's organization, but the 10 Rings are the organization that supply Vanko with his false identity papers to get him in to Monaco. And then they are the individuals that Hammer hires to break Vanko out of jail. They don't work for Hammer. He just hired the 10 Rings to do this. This is not really explained in the movie at all, but it's something I was kind of surprised to read in the novelization. Now, considering how big of a villain the Mandarin is and how keen the MCU was on like teeing things up for future movies, I'm surprised they didn't drop a hint at the 10 Rings being involved here at all. They just completely whiffed on it.
Now, my theory on this is there was already a lot of friction internally of how to properly portray a Mandarin villain because of just the problematic stereotypes that was associated with the original villain from the comics. And they finally get it right with the Shang-Chi release and actually tying it in that the actual 10 Rings guy is Shang-Chi's father, and that I wasn't in love with how they do the reveal for the character in the third movie, but I think that they were purposefully trying not to be too on the nose because they weren't even sure if they would include him as a villain in the series, which ultimately, technically, in the Iron Man films, they didn't.
No, you're right. I guess, Guy Pearce's character, he's not really the Mandarin.
No. And then yeah, so they kind of included but didn't include, right? At the end of the day.
Without stepping on the third Iron Man too much, so you weren't a fan of how they did that.
No, I just thought it was like lazy storytelling and just like not interesting storytelling.
It was pretty goofy what they did with the Ben Kingsley.
Very, very goofy, but like
Yeah, I
not
mean,
even in a fun way.
no, no. I haven't seen that movie in a while, and I'm kind of curious to rewatch it. And I will, because we're going to cover it, I think, on the next series. Iron Man 2 for me feels like what's called a lateral move. This movie, it didn't move things forward at all other than to introduce Black Widow and War Machine and Nick Fury, and we knew about Shield previously, but this is really the first movie where Shield takes like a center stage.
Right.
I always liked this movie as like an enjoyable entertainment, but I looking back on it now, I can understand why it's ranked low on the MCU movies, or at least I can understand why Marvel fans rank it low. It didn't move a lot of things forward. The best trilogy for me in the MCU will still always be Captain America because of
Good
the
pick.
story
Good
that it told.
pick.
Yeah, in the first Avenger, like we got our first look at the Infinity Stones. You didn't know it at the time, unless you were a true comic book fan. Then in the Winter Soldier, we learn how S.H.I.E.L.D. gets infiltrated by Hydra, which sets things up for the breakup of the Avengers and introduces Thanos in Civil War. This movie doesn't have those storytelling strengths, I don't think. Now, but this movie, to me, it has many of the same elements that made the first movie so good, which is why I enjoyed this movie when I first saw it. In some cases, like with the humor, I think it's even better than the first movie. There's some really funny stuff in this movie.
Right.
But overall, it's a lateral move with weak villains, and it doesn't have very deep characterizations. And it's a shame that they didn't get to go into the demon in a bottle stuff. I don't
Yeah.
need to see a movie about Tony Stark like going full tilt into alcoholism, but you brought this up earlier how that aspect of his character has always been one of the interesting things that's made Tony Stark such a compelling character, and they only scratched the surface of it here.
And I think part of it is maybe they didn't want to touch on that too much because how much that actually reflects the real life of Robert Downey Jr.
It's possible.
Not wanting to hurt like the commercial success of the film by like having folks look too much into his very controversial past. I mean, the studio made a huge gamble allowing Favreau to cast Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark. So touching on that storyline as a reminder of that probably wasn't in the best interest of the studio. And at the same time, I touched on this earlier. I do think that while this, like, I do agree this is a lateral move movie wise, it just makes sense that they were trying to figure out what to do in phase one and they were testing it out, and some things came on a little too strong. It was, let's have this be product placement, like let's figure out where to put in like introductions to the next movies, but also let's fit in some like really cool like Easter egg callbacks to like that Marvel fans will love. But then let's also like throw in like things that we'll probably be able to like sell toys on later. It was just they were trying to fit in a lot in this film, and we can see like this is where a really good example of like there was a lot cut out where in the end like you're just kind of left with very like on the surface like not great movie.
It's fluff. It's just a
Yeah.
fluff movie. It's like Wonder Bread.
Yeah, just no nutritional value.
Nope. No. Like everybody likes Wonder Bread. Well,
Yeah.
sort of.
Shouts out though, I will say I did love the Monaco scene where Tony Stark has to put on the suit. He has to survive his first interaction with Whiplash, but then also put on the briefcase suit, which was a callback to how he would put on his armor in like the 90s like Iron Man cartoon. I thought that was really cool.
It was cool. It's probably the best part of the movie. But I mentioned the lack of like proper action in this movie. The first Iron Man and the third Iron Man have way better action scenes in it. Like, yes, Monaco scene's great. The finale, it's just Iron Man and War Machine fighting a Russian guy in another Iron Man suit. It's like, okay, we've seen that before in the first movie. Now, and then I did neglect to mention, I guess the other action scene would be when Rhodey takes the suit at Tony's birthday party and when Tony's hammered and they fight. It's funny, it's entertaining, but there's no real stakes because like they're not going to
Right.
kill each other. Like
Right. It's not really like an action scene, right?
no, I mean I don't know anything you want to add. Like it's storytelling wise, it's just I think lateral move really is the best way to describe it.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's probably where we want to just kind of where we want to think of where does this movie stand from a storytelling perspective. It doesn't stand on its own legs to propel like a strong move story forward, but it just kind of crab walks its way into opening up like lanes for future Marvel films.
Yeah. Number 3 reason why this wasn't better, the acting. There's some great acting in this movie, and there's some not so great.
Oh yeah.
Downey's just amazing. It's a virtuoso performance. Like he really, it's not an overrated performance at all. It's a legendary performance. He's
Enough
amazing.
said.
He is on fire in this movie.
Yeah, it's a very very iconic role that Robert Downey Jr. has just really become Tony Stark and is who will be Tony Stark in people's minds for many many years to come.
I think this is the funniest he's ever been as Tony. Like the Senate hearing scene, it's really funny. The Monaco scenes before the fight, when he's just interacting with Hammer, his disdain for Justin Hammer is hilarious to me. It's some of the funniest stuff he's ever done. Do you remember when they're at the bar and Hammer comes out? He's like Anthony,
Yeah.
and then what's
Yes.
her name there is Leslie Bibb, who's actually Sam Rockwell's wife in real life,
Did
which
not know that.
only makes the scene funnier. How Pepper says oh, she did a spread on Tony last year, and Tony says she also wrote a story. It's hilarious.
So good.
It's so great. That's he makes the movie tolerable. Like
Perfect
he's
delivery.
so
Perfect
funny.
delivery.
Yes,
Sells it.
yes. Where she's like, she's like, Christine Everhart from Vanity Fair, and he's like, roughly, yes. It's great stuff. Yeah, he's great. I mean, Gwyneth Paltrow, I really like her as Pepper Potts. She has real chemistry with Downey. It's something that's missing from a lot of superhero movies. That kind
Yeah.
of chemistry.
It really grounds it in reality that you can really feel that like tension and chemistry.
Yeah. Now, even though she's just a vehicle to introduce more Avengers, Scarlett Johansson, she sizzles.
No
Look,
kidding.
she's fantastic. Obviously, she's great to look at. She's smoking hot. But there's an intelligence to the way she portrays the character. You can see the wheels turning behind her eyes. And it's clear that she did a lot of fight training. She sells all the action. If there's a stunt double that's being used in a lot of these scenes, I can't really tell.
Yeah, no, I think it was a very spot on Black Widow, right? Like
Yeah.
like someone that is going to draw in someone not realizing that this is thinking it's just some like sexy assistant type to then realize that they've passed out because she put them in a chokehold.
Yeah, she was a great choice. Who knows what this would have been with Emily Blunt in the role, but I don't think anybody's complaining about Scarlett Johansson getting the role. Maybe except Emily Blunt. Now, Don Cheadle, I think he's an upgrade over Terrence Howard. I'm happy with that replacement.
Yep.
How'd you feel about Mickey Rourke?
So this was something I wanted to touch on, and like I hadn't done the due diligence to look it up, but correct me if I'm wrong. This was also This was also interestingly enough part of Mickey Rourke's return to Hollywood. Was this film and then another film, The Wrestler? Is that right?
That was a couple years before this.
Right. So
He
Mickey
probably
Rourke
got the
was
role in here because of The Wrestler. I would
right.
imagine.
So Mickey Rourke also has an interesting relationship with Hollywood. I think it
Yes.
definitely is interesting to see him in this role. And in general, I like to I think Mickey Rourke's a great actor, but it did not shine through in this film, in my opinion.
I like what he did physically. Like he obviously put a lot of preparation into the role. He bulked up. He had all the I mean, I don't know much about Russian prison tattoos. In fact, I don't know anything about Russian prison tattoos, but it he apparently did a lot of research into that and that was
Yeah,
all authentic.
I'll send you a book on it. Don't worry.
Thanks. He certainly sold the look of the character that he was portraying. And apparently, the bird was his idea. He paid for that out of his own pocket. He got the look of it right. I can't say that I'm a Mickey Rourke fan. I didn't think his acting was very convincing. Now, to be fair to him, he had a lot of his scenes cut. He didn't have a lot to do. It was very perhaps appropriate for the movie, but it was very melodramatic acting. And there's no better example of this during the opening credits when his father dies. It's some of the worst acting I've ever seen in a Marvel movie. If you remember, um, he takes a long pull off the bottle of vodka and then just screams twice. He's like, ah, ah. That's it. That's how he reacts to his father
I
dying.
almost want to say it's because it's out of context and we cut so much of his character out of the film. But
Maybe.
but like honestly, I'm like I can't explain that. It was literally in the beginning of the film. I can't explain it.
Ah, ah.
Yeah, no, I think Mickey Rourke. I think in general, the reception of Mickey Rourke in the film was not a great fit. If there were more scenes that made it make sense, like they were definitely cut. I think it was a missed opportunity because like there was a much meatier story that could have been told versus, hey, let's have another shot at like the villain being just another evil Iron Man type by the end of it.
Yeah, it pretty one-dimensional character. And like we touched on earlier, it could have been much better because the history that he had with Tony's father barely touched on. Nick Fury tells him a little speech. He's like, "Oh, yep, he got deported for selling secrets and he died." It's like, "Oh, great, thanks." The other villain in this movie, I'm using this term loosely, Sam Rockwell, who's a great actor, very funny actor. He's very funny in this role as Justin Hammer. But this is an example to me where it's an entertaining performance, but it didn't serve this movie's interests at all for me. Hammer comes across as a complete buffoon who's not very threatening. Now, I understand he did what he was supposed to do because that's how they wrote the character, right?
Right.
But actually, caveat that. Read the novelization because he is not nearly as goofy or not nearly as much of a buffoon in the novelization as he is on screen. I think that can be largely chalked up to Sam Rockwell ad-libbing a lot of stuff. And to be fair, it's very entertaining. When he gives the ex-wife speech to Don Cheadle and the other military officer, when he's giving, these are the Cubans, these are the Monte Cristos, baby. That's really funny stuff. But as a villain, at no point could I take him seriously. I never believed he could best Tony Stark at anything. It's fluff, just like the movie.
Yeah. What's funny is so I thought in general, I think Sam Rockwell has shown that he can have a lot of depth in his roles.
Yeah.
But in this particular portrayal, it was just like Justin Hammer's just a stooge. And I feel like there could have been more depth, but maybe that's just not the play that the film was going for. Maybe it was more, let's keep this lighter because we want to be able to sell this to kids. But at the end of the day, I don't like we've touched on this. That shouldn't be the reason why a film should be bad. Like we know
No.
films that are meant to be aimed at a wider audience can still have a lot of depth and be very good. And so just a missed opportunity again.
Yeah, he's very funny and he makes me laugh in the movie, but I think he's miscast. That role works much better if it's an intelligent character that you can actually believe has the ability to best Tony Stark at something. I'm not saying it needs to be just like Jeff Bridges' character Obadiah Stane in the first Iron Man movie, but any comic book movie or any movie in general with the villain, at some point, the villain only works if you can at least convince yourself somewhat that the villain is capable of besting the hero, right? Like what would happen in Iron Man 3. I think they course corrected that considerably with what wasn't the Mandarin, but how they chose to portray the Mandarin. You're like, wow, this guy might have Tony's number.
Right, right.
None of that happens here at all. Anything you want to add, Anton?
Just a shout out, Sam Rockwell. I saw this film recently and just want to put it out there into the ether and have folks revisit in case they have like an afternoon and want to kill like an hour and a half. Watch Mr. Right. It stars Sam Rockwell and Anna Kendrick, and Sam Rockwell plays like a very aloof like assassin in New Orleans. Fun film. Not
I've never heard of it.
it's a it's a fun film. A few concepts were weird, but a lot of guns, a lot of action, and a fun one to chump on popcorn and watch.
What's the movie he won an Academy Award for?
Was it Three Billboards?
I believe so.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's
That was
he's really good. He's a great
yeah.
actor. He really is. Just I don't think this was the role for him. That wraps up our discussion of why Iron Man 2 wasn't better. We talked about the studio interference that led to the storytelling and the script issues. And we concluded with the performances, which we felt were uneven. Wrapping this all up, Anton, you go first here. Did you like this movie, massive comic fan that you are?
Well, at the end of the day, I did enjoy this film when I watched it, but I was disappointed. I'm very overly critical of comic book films because I'm a comic book fan. Also being a film fan, I think there's this added layer of expectation where I tell myself, "Oh, it's a film. Like the director should have the freedom to like be brave and do something different than what was originally in the comic book because that's where real groundbreaking fun stuff happens." And when I don't see it, I just get disappointed because then you get a watered down version of the comic and the watered down version of a film, which is basically what we got with Iron Man 2. But even with that, it was still like it was fun. There were moments that like I still can look back and enjoy fondly, and I will go back and watch this film. Having said that, I give this film a solid C in my book. A great example of like a lot of really cool things, but not everything works together. But hey, you get through it in the end and you really want to buy an Audi.
This movie definitely made me want an R8. So it's a success there. I'm right there with you. I can see the faults. This movie's got some serious faults. I always found this a bit of a guilty pleasure, and I find it weirdly rewatchable, but I don't think it's a very good movie. I like the comedic stuff in it, and it's one of the Marvel movies that I actually rewatch the most, even though it's like I said, I don't think it's very good. Objectively speaking, after reading I read some of the criticisms on the Marvel forums because as just not a comic book guy, I'm like, I wonder what comic book fans think of this movie. So I went on some of the forums. I understand the dislike for this movie. The storytelling and the villains are very shallow. This movie is more entertaining to me than it's fulfilling. It's just fluff. And like the Bond sequel that we covered, Quantum of Solace, this feels like a lateral move. Didn't move much forward for me. I give this a C as well. Robert Downey Jr. is so charming and magnetic in this movie that I ultimately enjoy it despite the significant flaws. He alone makes this movie watchable. So both of us give it a C. And then this got me thinking, what is the lowest grade possible for a film where you'd consider it rewatchable? Like how bad does it have to be objectively or as objective as you can be to give it a rating? How bad does it have to be before you cut it off and you won't rewatch a movie?
I think anything lower than like I almost want to say like a D plus. Let's take a look if there are any films on the scale that's a D that I'll actively try to go out and watch again. But usually at that point, it's like I was not happy. I would and an F, no reason to revisit. Right?
No. Well, I'm looking at our ratings right now of all the movies that we've covered so far. I'm going to list the ones that either both of us or at least one of us has rated it a D plus or above. Planet of the Apes. I would never rewatch that movie.
Now I think I put that one at a D plus. Right?
You did.
So yeah, that sounds about right. I would watch that again just to laugh at it.
You would actually put it on yourself?
Oh yeah, like I would. That's like a fun film that I would love to show, like show someone that like my wife's never seen it, and
Okay.
so
All right. Okay.
so I'd be like, hey, let's watch this. This is bad.
You gave The Matrix Reloaded a D minus.
Yeah, that's one where I was so disappointed. I would rather skip that one. Yeah.
Both of us gave Superman 2 less than a D plus, so no.
Yeah.
Yeah. That makes sense. I think I'm right there with you. Anything in the C range, I would rewatch,
Yeah,
probably.
absolutely.
Other than Gangs of New York, no way.
It's like I kind of think of it like Yelp star reviews for food. I feel like I'll eat it like if it's like 3 out of 5. It's like people are like, oh, 3, that's not great. It's like 3 is actually not bad. Like that's kind of average. Like I'll try it. Like why not?
Yeah,
4 and 5 is like solid, but 3 is like maybe there's not like maybe there's something there to revisit.
that's
But then
fair.
like 2, you're like really
No,
maybe once every 2 years just to see if it's gotten better. And then if it's got 1 star on it, like it shouldn't even be on the list. It's like that's bad.
if it averages 1 star, I don't even think it would be on Yelp, would it? We'd probably remove it.
I'd have to look and see. I haven't checked.
There's a shout out to a bar in Chelsea. I think it's on 24th and 7th. It's called the 1 Star. It's like a joke on the Yelp.
Mm-hmm.
You can get a beer and a shot for $7.
Not a bad deal in this
Not at
day and
all.
age.
Yep. Look, they got free advertising on a podcast. They're winning. That's it for this. This edition of Why Wasn't It Better? Iron Man 2. Yeah, both gave it C. Probably going to be more interesting when we talk about the next Iron Man movie. I think that's more fun to cover.
Definitely more to cover. Absolutely. And I think
Yeah,
it'll
there's
be fun to
yeah.
also touch on more MCU films in general.
Yes. Yes. You've seen the ones I had on the list. If you want to add to it, please do. Because I feel like some of them are considered disappointing, others aren't, regardless of how we feel about them. But we'll get into it more. So it's my turn to pick next week. I would like to pick another movie that features Robert Downey Jr. in it.
Okay.
It's a movie that some would call a sequel, but I would call a spinoff from the 1993 film The Fugitive. It stars Tommy Lee Jones, Wesley Snipes, and our boy Robert Downey Jr. at the height of what we will call his controversial period. The movie is U.S. Marshals.
Very excited for this one.
It's going to be interesting to discuss because it's one of those movies that I saw it a bunch when I was younger, and I did not realize how poorly reviewed it was. Do you have any movies like that you watch as a kid and you enjoy, and years later you're like, this has bad reviews? Why?
Yeah, I have no idea why Small Soldiers would ever have a bad review.
Man, I forgot about Small Soldiers. That's a movie I probably will never revisit. No need.
Yep, you got no reason to, bud.
But U.S. Marshals, which came out around the same time, 1998, peak Wesley Snipes, same year that he was in Blade. Peak Wesley Snipes.
Love
I'm
me
a
some
big
Wesley
Wesley Snipes
Snipes.
guy. Yeah, I'm a big Wesley Snipes. You want to hear my hot take? I'm going to bring it up on the U.S. Marshals podcast, but I'll
Give it to
I'll
the
say it
listeners now.
A far more interesting, talented actor than Will Smith in the 90s. Will Smith just had a better career.
I hear that. I think definitely a lot of parallels. Very famous black actors, and also really interesting to see what roles they said yes to versus not. So
that's what separates the two. I think Wesley Snipes just took more interesting roles. Will Smith took far more lucrative roles and didn't go to prison for tax evasion. So that's a win in his book.
But Snipes is the better actor, for sure.
I think so. It's probably not a popular opinion, but it's a hill I will die on.
Well, if that doesn't get you excited, listeners, well, tune in next week for our release for U.S. Marshals. But until then, we're your hosts. I'm Anton Paras.
I'm Patrick Darms. And as always, this podcast was produced by Eric Taylor. You can find him on Spotify and Instagram at Might Be Thunder. And that's it for this edition of Why Wasn't It Better? We will see you next week when we talk about U.S. Marshals.
Boom. Later.